This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 225 of the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network. In this episode, I sit down with Jessica Lane, founder of Data-Informed Impact, to unpack the critical role of data in K-12 education and how to use it responsibly, effectively, and equitably. Jessica shares her expertise on building strong data culture in schools, improving data literacy, and creating clear ethical data visualizations that empower, not overwhelm, educators and leaders. We explore the often overlooked human side of data, how to build trust around data use, avoid duplicative processes that drain educators' time, and leverage data to evaluate systems. Jessica also offers insights into how different stakeholders like teachers, administrators, or district leaders use data from both micro and macro lenses, and how EdTech plays a role in the broader data landscape. Whether you're a teacher, building leader, or part of a district team, this conversation will help you think critically about using data as a tool for improvement, not just compliance. To tell you a little bit about our guest, as the founder of Data-Informed Impact, Jessica Lane is known for turning webs of data into easy-to-leverage visual dashboard systems and training for K-12 schools, fully equipping leaders and teachers to close the student success gap together. Having created custom solutions for 160 schools across the United States and Canada since 2020, she's an educational data expert. With over 10 years of experience from all angles of the classroom, Jessica's a former data coach, instructional coach, certified math teacher, and holds a master in education and learning and technology. Proudly data-informed and people-driven, she believes that data can tell great student success stories if we let it guide, not decide how to lead education forward. Jessica currently lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she can be found excitedly exploring spreadsheets, brain studies, Brené Brown books, and puzzles. And when she's not partnering with schools, she's caring for her daughter, Emmy, or one of her 50 houseplants. Before we get going, I wanted to invite you to check out the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course that helps school leaders launch their executive functioning implementation plan. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Jessica Lane. Today, I am joined by Jessica Lane from Data-Informed Impact. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Hi, yeah, I'm so excited to be talking about all things data, but
Yeah,
mostly data culture. That's kind of my thing right now. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I want to get into some definitions because I know what you're talking about because in my job, we talk about data culture and literacy and visualization all the time, but I'm not sure if that's, again, depending on what role the audience members might be in, those might not be terms that they're familiar with. But maybe we should start off with just having you tell us a little bit about your backstory, what you're doing now, and yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, perfect. So, I am the founder of Data Informed Impact. I actually started as a high school math teacher several years ago. I grew up in Cincinnati, but my teaching experience was in Chicago. So, I had this really unique experience of working in a really new school. I started there the second year that they were open. We had a principal for the first year and a half. We tried a couple different principals, and then we eventually ended up going to a team-led school.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, so it was a really unique experience because we did have like a CEO and a CFO because it was a charter school.
Mm-hmm.
And when we all sat down to make decisions, they would say, your guys's votes are have just as much weight as our votes.
Mm-hmm.
So we were truly coming together, making decisions about logistics, about curriculum, about pretty much everything that you could be, everything that comes with running a school. And it was a really interesting experience as I think I started there my third year of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I I started in being part of that like team that was running the school. I also additionally started instructional coaching my third or fourth year of teaching. So I was definitely kind of challenged to go into more leadership roles very early on. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, my first year was really tough, as most teachers
Yeah.
can, or anybody in
And so you
education
were
can
in
relate to.
Chicago your first year?
I was in Chicago my first
Okay.
several years.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I was in West Garfield Park, which is known for, having a lot of sticky situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a lot of students that were dealing with a ton of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very eye-opening experience. I say it not only framed me as a teacher, but also just framed me as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned so much about building relationships as an educator and how to support the whole child, not just academically, but also with any kind of social emotional needs as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up when we were in Chicago, I had my daughter Emmy, that was a little over 8 years ago. She just turned 8. And my ex-husband and I decided that we wanted to move back to be around family. So we ended up coming back to Cincinnati. And I was exhausted because the career that I had chosen in Chicago was not just a career, it was a lifestyle. And it was very difficult to be a new mom and also give what I needed to give to those students. So I considered a career change to computer science. It had always been something I was interested in. I even started a degree, an online degree for it. And then I got a call asking me to be an instructional coach for Cincinnati public schools. And I was like, I can't leave education.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's just,
Yeah.
if anybody asks me to come back, I'm back 100%. And so I ended up working for an educational service center contracted through Cincinnati Public Schools. And I was an instructional coach there. That was a rough situation just because we didn't really have a home. Like the schools weren't our home because they looked at us as a district employee. The district wasn't our home because they looked at us as contracted employees.
Yeah.
They cut their ties about halfway through, and I ended up getting a job as a data coach for a much smaller school district within the city limits. So they have one elementary, one middle, one high school. A few years after starting, actually during COVID, they started their alternative virtual school. Uh, but what I discovered, and that was I started there 2019, 2020. Very fun year to start a new job.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I started, they didn't really have a whole lot for me to do. They're still trying to figure out it was a grant
Yeah.
position. There were teams that were working on filling out this reteaching form, and we couldn't even get to the reflection part because we were so lost in the tedious work of filling out this form.
Mm-hmm.
I recreated it on a spreadsheet, which took all of the tedious work out of it so that we could get down to the actual reflection and action. Um, and I started just kind of filling that need in the district. Um, and people started coming to me saying, you should do this for other schools. I was like, no, I'm happy. I love what I'm doing. And then my boss came to me. She's like, No, like you have the skill set, and if you are even just like willing to just give a tiny bit of your time to other schools that need that, you should. And they started sending me to conferences to talk to people and network, and um, I started a side business, um, went viral in a couple Facebook groups, and viral in terms of like an educational Facebook group, not actually viral.
Not like Mr. Beast viral.
Well, close, but
Yeah.
but enough to where I started working with schools all
Yeah.
over on all of these data dashboards and systems. And what I found was that it was not super fulfilling because I would create these tools and then I would ask them how it's going and it would be crickets. People weren't really using them. And I was like,
Yeah.
what's missing here?
Hmm.
So a few years ago, I rebranded and started working not only with data visualization, but also data literacy and data culture. And I went full time with that consulting position last summer, which brings me to now where I'm working with schools and with educators on all things data culture, data literacy, and data visualization.
Wow. So lots of things there. I want to go
Yeah.
back to what you said about you created this Excel, you had this process that was really tedious, and then you
Mm.
put it into an Excel spreadsheet and that kind of streamlined things. So what exactly was the part of the process that was tedious? And then how did the spreadsheet get you to a point where you removed some of that?
Yeah, sure. So, essentially, we were doing a lot of double work because the teachers were assessing their students and they were putting their grades in the grade book, but then they'd have to this form was on a Microsoft document, so they would have to type them in. They would have to
Hmm.
find averages, find numbers of students who fit in different groups, and the formatting alone was just like we would try to type something in a spot and it would like go somewhere else
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was just so messy. And so when I recreated it, essentially I made it to where they could just copy and paste from their grade book and
Hmm.
it would sort all of their students and it would give them like highlight the trends and highlight the students that were in need of different supports. And then the part that was left for them was just filling out like a reteaching template,
Hmm.
which involved like looking at strengths and weaknesses and coming up with a plan for those students who either needed that additional support or needed an extension from the lesson.
So, yeah, I think about those things all the time in my role as well. There's a lot of where are we duplicating? Where are we filling out a form and then filling out another form and then filling out another form that has the same information that
Yes.
maybe we could auto populate or take what we're doing over here and just literally paste it over here, and make it less cumbersome. So yeah, the idea of duplication is definitely familiar to me. So when you put it in the Excel spreadsheet, that just was you're using the tool that's already there and the features that are available in the tool to like create some kind of a visualization or show what's there, show the data in a way that is easier to consume. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, absolutely. Showing the data in a way that's easy to consume and also giving them a spot to reflect on that data
Hmm.
and keep track of their notes and their plan. This was something that the district had decided was part of like their improvement plan was to
Hmm.
have teachers fill out these forms. I like to think of it as a habit building form, and I'll share a link. I have it on my website, the
Hmm.
reteaching tool. uh, I consider a habit building tool. I don't think every teacher is in need of something like that, but I do think it's a great place to start when it
Hmm.
comes to kind of leading a teacher through what would be a data cycle, a cycle of looking at that data, understanding it, asking the right questions, and acting on the results.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's funny that you talked about all the duplicate paperwork. That position ended up like once people knew that I could automate things and I had learned that skill set, I started automating everything for that district. Like it's so wild the number of systems I have
Yeah.
still that I
Yeah.
work with them on because there's
Hmm.
so many times in education, even not even related to data, where people are just filling out things over and over and over again. It's so tedious. It's so such time suck.
Yeah. I have so many questions. So I want to get to some of these terms that you said at the beginning. So we said data cycle, and you explained what that was. It's basically um, the collection, the analysis, and then the reflection, and then the repeating. Did I miss any steps there?
I like to I kind of that's my definition of data literacy actually is being
Okay.
able to understand the data, ask the right questions, and come and are comfortable acting on the data. And
Okay.
there are a million different data cycles out there. I have chosen not to. I do have like some examples that I've used with different schools. It's not something that I don't find the need to, there's no gap there. We have plenty of data cycles to look at.
Yeah.
There's data wise from Harvard, there's PDSA,
Hmm.
um, all kinds of things. But no matter what data cycle you look at, you are understanding, you are looking at that data, you need to be able to understand what it is telling you. You
Hmm.
need to be able to ask the right questions and you need to be able to act on it.
Hmm.
Um, and that also goes with data cycles where, you know, like we are just talking about, where you're coming up with a reteaching plan within the classroom. It can also apply to intervention teams if you're talking about interventions for small groups, tiered interventions, MTSS,
Hmm.
RTI. And then it can also go up to those higher levels where you're looking at district decisions or building decisions and leadership teams. So, uh, regardless, I data literacy to me is understanding, asking, and acting.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's one question I had. What about when we say data culture and data visualization? What are those things and how would that fit into data literacy?
Yeah, so there's overlap between all of them.
Hmm.
I'm going to get data visualization out of the way because I feel like that's a pretty easy one.
Yeah.
And by easy, I mean it's easy to conceptualize. It's not so there's a skill set that goes along with that.
Yeah.
Um, but to me, it's just knowing your audience, being able to create visualizations that are clear and that are conducive to creating curiosity.
Hmm.
You want your staff to be curious about the data that they're looking at, because that curiosity then leads them to ask those better questions. Um, but I really like to say that data culture is the foundation of all data work in schools. If you don't have a healthy data culture, then you're gonna be spinning your wheels. It's not gonna work out. And so I've done a lot of work over the past several years, just kind of defining what makes up that healthy data culture.
Hmm.
And to me, it's trust. There has to be a trust there. There has to be a psychological safety. And I always talk about those two first. And there's a ton of overlap there, right? Because those are both like emotional components.
Hmm.
Um, Trust to me is trusting that the data isn't going to be used against you in a tangible way. So like an
Yeah.
evaluation, somebody coming back for some kind of accountability meeting. Um, and then the psychological safety to me kind of it represents a little bit more of the not fearing the judgment. So being able to make mistakes and learn from them in a group setting without feeling like people are judging you.
Hmm.
So trust, psychological safety, collaboration is a huge one. It is so important to get those different perspectives in the room and be able to have those conversations. I always tell leaders, you are not going to get a change of mindset from a change of procedure. That's not going to happen. You need those conversations, you need those collaborations, you need that discussion. That's what's going to guide that change of mindset. And in order to make those big changes in your building, you're going to have to change some mindsets. And then there's leadership, obviously. So we have trust, psychological safety, collaboration, leadership. Your leaders can't just be checking boxes. We talked about data, check. We had
Hmm.
that data meeting, check. They need to be able to model that cycle. We want to make sure we're coming back to that data, not just making a plan and letting it sit in the corner of our office. Um, and I say that because I've done it before. These are things I've
Hmm.
done.
Yeah.
So we have trust, psychological safety, leadership, collaboration, capacity. You don't want, as much as you want that strong leader in there, you don't want the leader to be the consistent facilitator. You want to give that job to other staff members. Make sure that you're building capacity within your school system. That way, especially right now with teachers coming and going as often as they are, or other staff members coming and going as often as they are, we need to build that capacity within our staff, and then protected time, which is the hardest
Yeah.
because we have so little of it.
Hmm.
But what we schedule, what we prioritize is what gets done. So,
Hmm. So I guess a loaded question to take from here. So like let's say that you've got the culture, people understand that this data is going to be used to make decisions and improve, and it's not going to be, like you said, used against you. We understand what visualizations are easy to read. We understand what we're looking at. And then, of course, we understand what we're measuring, our data cycles. So I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is, okay, you've got some of these processes automated, and you might have an efficient way to look at this data and visualize it. How do you know that the data is meaningful? Because I know there's a lot of people who think, oh, schools are all about the numbers, it's all about standardized tests, and it's, not about the qualitative and the human element, and the numbers don't tell you everything. And there's skepticism about data, which I know is part of data culture, but I guess that would be like, how do you get to data that is meaningful and data that's actually telling you something of quality, and supplement that with other measures. And I'm thinking about a lot of my colleagues who are often feel pressured to use things like standard scores to qualify students for special education, for, kids who they need an evaluation for things that are impacting language and cognition that are sometimes hard to represent with numbers. So yeah, how do you know that your data is reliable, valid, meaningful, all of those things?
yeah, that's such a great question. And there's a lot to unpack there. We talk about people getting defensive when we talk about data as numbers, and there are different reasons for that. Even if we look back in history, data has been used as a tool for accountability in education over and over again. That's how
Hmm.
it was introduced. A nation
Yeah.
at risk, no child left behind. Like these are all accountability uh, initiatives,
Hmm.
and so we often feel like it's used as a weapon, but then to add in the fact that we're talking about little humans,
Hmm.
and we don't want to say that human is a number, because that's not
Yeah.
true, right?
Hmm.
We all went into education because we wanted to make an impact, and we realized that impact has to do with that human, not just some test score.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of background there. And I think in order to kind of start um, tearing down those walls and getting down to that foundation of data culture, we have to be able to, one, understand that while not all data is perfect, not all data is like people like to say numbers don't lie. You can make numbers. I can make lots of numbers lie. Let me
Yes.
tell you,
Yeah. Oh,
numbers
so
can lie.
much.
But I do think there's truth in saying that all data is valuable. And what I mean by that is, even if you're collecting data and you're looking at it and you can bring other information, other data to back up to support the fact that initial data source is not valid or does not make sense, there's value in saying that didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Let's find something else. Um, and I think that's a constant conversation that you have to have. But I also think that, even if it doesn't tell the whole picture, which no data source is going to tell the whole picture,
Right. Mm-hmm.
um, then you can still find something in there to grow from. And so I love this idea. I've done this before with groups that are feeling especially defensive about a particular data source. Um, I'll put it up in a meeting and before we even talk about that data and get into like the nitty gritty, the understanding, the asking, the acting, I'll just stand up at the whiteboard with the marker and say, what do we not see in this data? What's not included?
Mm-hmm.
And, there are things like, of course, like attendance problems, behavior problems. If we're talking about academic data, maybe those things are not showing up in there
Yeah.
as clearly. There's also, we had a group of students who made tremendous growth on something else that's not within this data that we want to be able to celebrate.
Yeah.
And opening that question up not only helps us add context to that data, which is necessary in order for us
Mm-hmm.
to make decisions, but it also gives those staff members a safe space to get all of that out of their system and recognize that they're being heard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because what I find is if we don't talk about those things first, the entire process is being weighed down by that thought of this facilitator or this person who's leading this meeting does not understand what's missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so important that we bring all of that context in, that teacher insight, and their professional judgment, bring all that to the table when we're making decisions about our students because we don't have all the information and
Yeah.
we don't ever want to pretend like we have all the information. We don't.
Are you working with students who experience anxiety and overwhelm with new challenges, who refuse or avoid difficult tasks, or require constant prompting? Or maybe they have difficulty filtering distractions, they're missing assignments, they tend to run late, and they struggle to transfer skills from one setting to another, or don't appear to learn from past mistakes. These behaviors are showing up more and more frequently in classrooms across schools and not just in special education. The truth is, we're seeing a surge of students in both general and special education who desperately need these foundational skills. With so many competing priorities and options for educators, it seems impossible for school leaders to know where to focus their attention. What if there was a way to transform multiple challenges with one powerful approach without overwhelming your already maxed out team? Turns out there is. Beneath many of these challenges often lies a powerful root cause: executive functioning. Executive functioning skills are the critical mental processes that work behind the scenes as your internal coach, acting like your brain's CEO. These powerful cognitive abilities help you manage frustrations, make decisions, follow through on plans, envision the future, and adapt when things don't go as expected. And let's be honest, teachers are drowning between curriculum requirements, testing pressures, behavior management, and the mountain of paperwork. They're stretched thinner than ever. The last thing they need is another standalone program to implement. That's why I've created the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to launching your team's executive functioning implementation plan. When you join, each day you'll get an email with a summary walking you through a foundational concept that will help you design an implementation plan for your team. We'll uncover executive functioning challenges, and I'll show you how to identify the telltale signs. We'll organize skills for intervention, and we'll wrap up with essential takeaways and a prompt to help you get started with your 90-day action plan, plus a curated list of resources to provide support and help you implement what you've learned. To learn more about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, go to drkarendudekbrannan.com/school leaders. So I guess to piggyback on that, I find that sometimes, and this is in my role as well. I have some data stewardship roles, and there's all kinds of things about, well, this data warehouse has this data, and this third party consultant that's supporting us has this data over here, and that like people just keep using that word. And sometimes I'm sitting in these meetings as the person who's supposed to be like, knowledgeable about the data, and I have no idea what they're talking about. They just say it like this, it's this abstract word, and I'm like, what data? Like, what does that even mean? And so I think sometimes people will walk into these conversations and be like, you know, our data, like we need to have more secure data, or we need to make database decisions. And I'm like, but what data? Like, what are you measuring, and how are you measuring it? So like how do we make it less vague so that when we're having a conversation about data, we know that we're talking about the same thing. And I guess maybe, I'm thinking of an example here, like how would we, if you have a teacher who's thinking about data, and then you have a superintendent who's thinking about data, and they just keep saying that word over and over again, are they really thinking about the same thing? Like, as somebody who's worked with a lot of different groups, what are the different like ways that we collect data, and then actual data itself that would be relevant to all those different groups of people? And do you find that do you also find that as well, where people keep saying that word and I'm like, what are we talking about? You know?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I actually have a blog post that says what your principal means when they ask you if you're using data. Because most of the time the principals don't even know what they're asking
It's
for.
like,
They're
I'm
like,
supposed to ask about this. Check it out the list.
yes,
Nothing,
it's checking it off.
so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think really that all comes down to that understand, ask, act, because regardless of what data you're looking at, we should not be talking about collecting data. We should not be talking about um this abstract, we have this data system over here, unless we are talking about it in the context of making decisions, in the
Yeah.
context of those data cycles. What's happening and what's happened in the past is that we it's been decided that data is incredibly important for the world, but also for education, mostly
Hmm.
because of accountability. And so what happened was all of these schools were like, oh shoot, we need to be able to show data
Hmm.
to the state. And
Or the
so we
feds.
Yep, or even further up, keep going.
Yep.
Um, and so uh and so what happened was we had this gap where we needed to be able to collect data efficiently. So we had all of these EdTech programs and all of these assessments come in and say, okay, we're here to fill this gap. And so we ended up over assessing, over collecting, and not doing anything with it. And
Hmm.
so we have all this data, but are we using it in the right ways? And so I feel like it shouldn't start with that. The idea of using data shouldn't start with, oh, look at this fancy new tool,
Hmm.
or oh, we need to check off this box. Instead, it should start with, what are we trying to improve,
Hmm.
and what's the data that we can use to measure that improvement.
Hmm.
It should always be a conversation about growth, and a conversation that, again, is going in a cycle. We're not just collecting to collect. We're not just assessing to assess. We are taking that data, we are pulling the value from it in terms of, have we made progress? Yes, no, what decisions can be made based on that data?
Hmm. Yeah. Can you give some examples of like actual metrics that might be relevant to different stakeholders? And
Yeah,
I know you have a guide that I looked at and I wrote down some examples of data, or actually they're more like data collection tools, and I'm sure that we can infer what kinds of numbers, data you might get within these, but can you give a couple examples of things that you've focused on, or yeah,
yeah.
maybe go through some specifics?
Yeah, for sure. So, we'll go from the top down. So,
Yeah.
when we're making district decisions or building decisions, we're often looking at academic academic data, which is typically split into subjects. A lot of times, reading and math are the two highest, but then we
Mhm.
also
Yeah.
incorporate some other subjects. We're looking at behavioral data. That behavioral data can be collected in lots of different ways. Often it's collected in terms of referrals.
Hmm.
Um, and then we are looking at attendance data. So we have academic behavior attendance. I feel like the one missing from there is going to be our social emotional data,
Yeah. Yeah.
which we are starting to get better about.
Hmm.
And so I feel like those four are typically going to be where we start when we're making those district decisions or those building decisions. All the what we collect should always be determined by some kind of strategic plan or
Hmm.
some kind of improvement plan. Um, Again, we're not collecting for the sake of collecting. We're not collecting for the sake of checking a box. We want to collect to determine whether or not what we're doing is having an impact on students, student learning, students' well-being. Um, and so that's usually what I find myself being able to provide guidance in for districts and buildings.
Hmm.
We go down a little bit deeper and we get to those intervention teams, in which case we're looking at progress monitoring data.
Hmm.
So we're looking at some kind of small, very skill-based data that we can collect on a weekly or biweekly frequency so that we are able to determine whether or not this one specific intervention is having an impact on that student's learning. So we're looking again progress monitoring. And then we go a little bit deeper down to teacher data, and that's going to be just the day to day. That's going to be whether it's a formative assessment that
Hmm.
is a quiz, or it could be you're just walking around and taking note of which students understand and which students don't, and then pulling a small group to the side to reteach. That's using data. It's not formal, very informal, but it is a process of using data. In terms of data collecting tools, of course, like academics is the easiest one. We have diagnostics, we have screeners,
Hmm.
we have state assessments. Those are usually the different tools that most schools have access to. Um, and then we talked about behavior and attendance, and everything else is very unique to whoever is assessing and what the student that they're assessing, of course, as well.
Yeah. You just said one of my, I'd say a hot button topic that I like to talk about with progress monitoring and also making decisions in therapy, because I have a lot of clinicians, and I would say honestly, this would apply to teachers as well, anyone who's in that support staff role. So, speech pathologists, social workers, psychologists, counselors, reading interventionists, special ed teachers, all of those,
Yeah.
those staff who are responsible for some kind of specialized, skilled support service. Where many of them feel pressure like they have to use a norm referenced assessment. But those they're not intended for progress monitoring. They're
Right.
intended, maybe for your 3-year reevaluation. So you're not going to see progress in a standard score in language or cognitive or, something else when you measure it 3 weeks later. And so, again, and also there's a lot of, bias in those assessments. You definitely can't use them as a standalone and all of those things. But I like to use the word non-standardized instead of informal because when people say informal, it sounds less rigorous, but you could actually be using a tool that you've created and have hard numbers like raw data and it could be high quality, non-standardized, meaning that it's not norm referenced, but it could be very high quality and accurate, and you could scale it across people and all those things. And I find that people get confused with qualitative, quantitative as well, because they think if it's not standardized, if I don't get a score that's been norm referenced, that it's qualitative. Well, no, that means it's qualitative means descriptive. You can be quantitative and non-standardized and actually get numbers that you could use to make meaningful decisions. Now that might be more micro level, and it might take some work to get it to the macro level, but you can absolutely do it. So Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And honestly, that's where we see the most growth is when we're looking at those tiny data collection
Hmm.
tools, or those tiny formative assessments. It's much more difficult to see growth when we're looking at a large chunk of data or a
Yeah.
diagnostic, a state assessment, whatever it
Yeah.
is. And that growth is what leads us to know that what we're doing is working and
Yeah.
gives us that self-efficacy, and then which becomes as a group that collective efficacy, and that's what keeps us going. That's what okay, we're having an impact on the student. We see it in this tiny weekly data for this one specific skill. We can see that we're getting there. We're making progress. That student is learning. What's next?
Yeah.
What can I do
Hmm.
now that's going to have a greater impact? So there's so much there's such a benefit to looking at that tiny data versus the larger data sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that again, the skepticism a lot of times, and maybe this is just my audience who are looking at it very much at this individualized diagnostic micro level view of, an individual who has these very specific needs. It's frustrating because you feel like when you aggregate all of this information, like it doesn't apply. You don't see those individual differences that would lead to a diagnosis, even though obviously to have diagnostic information and to be able to make a diagnosis, you have to consider those types of
Right.
things and hallmark characteristics and all of that. But yeah, I think that the big data is where the skepticism comes, but also we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater because there is value in looking at it from
Exactly.
both a micro and a macro level lens. And I think that so I wanted to go back to what you said at the beginning about how you were a team-led school. I'm wondering if that gave you more of that macro level view. Because when I talk to people who have maybe gone from being a teacher to a principal, for example, so they're working directly with students, and then they're in a position where now they have direct reports. They're seeing it from a bird's eye view, and they're seeing things that they didn't see before. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody who's become a principal or any other type of administrator who hasn't said, like, I had no idea what they were dealing with. There's all kinds of things. Like, I thought it was this way and it was this way. And now I finally understand why my administrators asked me to do this thing that drove me crazy. And I think that when it comes to data and like some of that skepticism maybe changes when you are in a different position. So I'm curious if you probably in your consulting role now, but also even when you were at that team-led school, if you got to see both micro, macro, and how that changed the way you think about data or just, anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very unique experience, similar to that of being an instructional coach, or another position where you have that ability to take a step back and see things as a system, and see all of these different silos, essentially, to steal from
Hmm.
Casey Watts. And see kind of how those might be able to work together to have an impact on those students. So, um, but you also don't have the constraints that
Hmm.
a principal might have,
Yeah.
um, in terms of like, oh shoot, I am in charge of this whole building and everything's falling apart and it's so chaotic.
Yeah.
So it gives you that nice POV of like, oh, I can see how everything is working, but I can also focus on growth and the things that matter as opposed to like the operational, the
Yeah.
behavior issues,
Hmm.
how I'm trying to be a um instructional leader, but I don't have the time to be like
Hmm.
all of this stuff that usually bogs down administrators. So I do think my experience as being part of that team, being an instructional coach, a data coach, being able to be in those positions has definitely benefited my point of view when it comes to those that decision making.
Yeah. I could definitely see that. So I wanted to talk about data storage, data privacy, and how tech companies play into that. But yeah, I guess let's go there because I am just curious what when we're talking about things that can be automated and things that can be streamlined and scaled and made more efficient for teachers, we are taking data on students and then like now we have that information and then sometimes the State Board of Education has agreements with other agencies where they're sharing data and they got to share it with the state and the feds and like it goes places and it's like this you know, goes out into the vortex and what happens to it. And also, if you bring in a private company like an ed tech company, that has other implications for how they might use data. And again, I've heard all of these when I hear people who are frustrated with how tech companies are impacting education, it gets into that whole conversation about they have our data, what are they doing with it? And I'm just wondering like what your experience is with data storage and data privacy and what districts need to do in order to make sure that they're maintaining the integrity of it and keeping the data safe. And then what ways, like what are the ethical ways that we would use data, share data with those other entities in a way that is like reasonable, ethical, supports education without doing you know, other things that may be more self-serving for-profit companies. We'll just,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's such a tough question.
yeah,
And I think there's a lot going on right now around that question.
yeah,
There's an introduction of lots of different bills and
mhm,
new procedures when it comes to data privacy, which is it does provide it does create a little bit of a barrier when it comes to making things more automatic and efficient,
yeah.
but obviously for good reason. We don't want that data to be out there. And I think what's important is that you have someone on your team who knows how to read a contract.
Yeah.
Is so incredibly
Well,
important.
so you need your attorney.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. But even just like in
Or
terms of there are certain things that I've seen that have gone through schools that I'm just like, who, like the people that signed off on it clearly did not even like
so you mean like
consider.
the technical side of it? Like, did they know what they were signing from what the tech?
Yes.
Okay, so like, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I went to a uh, I think it was at FETC conference,
Mhm.
and there was a session there, and it was an attorney who was providing the session, and it was for schools and telling them what to look for
Mhm.
in some of these contracts.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I went as a vendor. I was like one of two people in the room that were actual vendors.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to know, like, what do I need to do to make sure that I am supporting the mission of keeping that data safe as well.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot. I don't have any specific opinions other than I feel like I'm not the one to have those opinions. So like
Yeah.
I often tell schools, like um, you you need to understand the legislation
Hmm.
surrounding this, and you need to have more than just your attorney or lawyer
Yeah.
on your staff to understand the implications of not paying attention
Yeah.
to what you're signing and what you're giving away.
Hmm.
I don't think that all um I don't I don't think that we should exclude all ed tech companies or
Yeah.
make any like
No,
huge
absolutely.
exclusions.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important topic for us to continue to talk about and um, stay aware of.
Yeah. And I know that sometimes it's like there's legislation, there's court cases, there's all these things that impact what what companies are required to do. And I know that when it goes to court, it seems, it's litigious. It's like, but like that is how certain
Yeah.
statutory requirements get put into place. And I think that it's very possible. Like, and I think of when I was in the schools, there were companies that in products that I used with my students that I thought were very good quality products. And I still think they're good quality products. And, there might have been things that were happening at those companies that I was completely unaware of. And maybe they're still good products. And then the companies just need to change their policies and and handle the data differently. Like I think the biggest thing that pops out that is like the obvious thing, and I know this because I do advertising for my business on Facebook and Instagram, and I know how retargeting works, where you put a pixel on your website, and then anybody that goes to your website, you would be able
Right.
to retarget. And so like if you have students who are using your platform for educational purposes and you're capturing their data in that way, that's a lot different than saying like, okay, we have this data sharing agreement with this other agency so that we can report on student outcomes and make sure that we have funding for our programs. To me, like those things are
Yes.
completely different. And so that's
Yes.
why when people are like, well, we need the data because it's important, or, oh, well, don't share the data because it's unethical. Well, like which data? Like we have to say which data. And that goes back to
Yep.
what you said about you have to have, the legal aspect, the policy aspect, and then the technical aspect. And I really see that as when it comes to education and like, other fields that are non-technical professions that now have to leverage these technical platforms, so important for them to have somebody in the room on their side representing their best interests to make sure that
Yes.
they're reading those contracts and understanding how all of these systems work.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of that honestly comes from, and I, I hate to say this, but a lot of these ed tech companies are not built by people in education, right?
Yeah.
They
Some
might be
of
an
them are,
idea.
but or they have people that work there, but you're like, but yeah,
Yes,
it's
they
such
had
a
like the
range.
educators have an idea, and then the people who are behind the scenes are typically people who are not used to working with
Yeah.
students, with little
Hmm.
humans, right? So
Right.
there's kind of like a gap there. And I've had lots of conversations about this recently just because
Yep.
I'm thinking about my own trajectory and where I
Yeah.
went ahead. And I think that we um, need to make sure that, the people that are building these systems are that we are using, they're not, like you said, they're not just a great tool, but they're also a great tool that exists for the right reasons.
Yeah. When I like before I had the position that I have now, um, working for the state, I actually was interviewing at or like looking into ed tech companies, and it was such a range, like such a range in how they set up their teams and who was on those teams making decisions. And even if you have all the people, it's like who's really making the decisions? Is it the
Oh,
marketing team? Is it the research team and the curriculum team? Like, even if you have these people, so you never know. You never know how it is until you actually
yep.
work there. But I talked to a lot of people who were former principals, teachers, clinicians who went to work for ed tech companies. So I think that there absolutely is that expertise at these companies that, making sure in a lot of these products where they are based on what is going to be helpful for students, but there's a lot, there's a lot of
Yeah. Like
companies,
you said, there's a range. There is a big
yeah.
range. Yeah.
The other thing that comes up a lot for me, and I don't know if this has come up for you as well, which with the automation thing, people get real excited about AI and what we should and shouldn't automate. And I know that sometimes there's like an AI policy where it's, yes, we want to automate and streamline. We don't want to have people who are skilled professionals sitting there like bogged down with admin work, but at the same time, we don't want to take it too far and automate what should be a clinical human decision. And that is
Yes.
a tough line to walk. I feel like I'm always like, hold on, guys, hold on. We shouldn't be automating this.
Yeah, yeah. I like the automation for the sake of making the reflection easier, but it's not replacing the reflection, right? Like
Yeah,
you can pull it together easier and make those insights more visible. But at the end of the day, there should be that human element behind the
Yeah.
decisions that you're making. Also, I'm not a fan of people who are throwing student data into AI,
Oh,
which I have
yeah.
seen an increase in people. I'm like, it is way too soon to be trusting that. People were like, well, they say they're not using it. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, please stop. That
Yeah.
scares me.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are different level. People have very different comfortability levels when it comes to that. But
Hmm.
I think that yes, automation is amazing, but at the end of the day, you're right. It needs to be, you need to have that human brain making those human brains making those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I know that everybody says this, but it is really about the right people like coming together to make those decisions. It's not, you need your IT, people who have your technical expertise to make sure that we understand the implications of how a technical application works. You need your legal, you need your administrator who understands operationally what's going on here. Like what decisions do we need to make? Like what's the data we need to evaluate systems versus students? And then you also need the people who are working directly with the students to make sure that this makes sense for the students and
Yes,
is aligned with best practices and all of those things, and then find a way to blend all of that together.
absolutely. It's all about that collaboration.
Yeah. So I know that we're getting close to the end. Where can people go to find out more about you? Do you have any resources that you want to recommend for people to just get an idea of the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so I am at data-informedimpact.com. And that's where you'll find my website and more about the things that I do. And I really want to maybe we'll drop the data culture framework in the show notes for people as
Okay.
well, because that's going to go a little bit deeper into those six components that we talked about. And I'll do the data literacy as well because we also talked about that. Two spots that you can go to learn a little bit more about what it looks like to have that healthy data culture and continue to improve the data literacy. Data visualization, that's my jam. I love to do it, but
Hmm.
I truly believe that you can make things happen without it, and you
Hmm.
can't make things happen if that's the only part that you're working on. So
Yeah,
the data culture and data literacy are going to be the two that people need to focus on the most.
great. Well, we will link to all those resources in the show notes. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, for sure. It was such a great conversation. It's so fun to talk about, all of these things and how they
Yeah,
have an impact on our schools. It's wild.
yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with our amazing guest. And also be sure to check the show notes for more information about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course that shows school leaders how to get started with their executive functioning implementation plan. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. I created the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support because educators have to be everything to everyone in current times. There always seems to be a new initiative, and it can be really difficult for teams to implement yet another standalone program. But the great news about executive functioning support is that it doesn't require complicated materials. It can be seamlessly layered onto existing practices and amplify the effort that you put into content area curriculum. And most importantly, executive functioning support can help you to differentiate instruction for those students who need support in special education as well as general education. It can be a really powerful universal design initiative that ensures you're meeting students where they're at. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with anyone you think would benefit from the information. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.